Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. The Bitcoin Association Switzerland is happy to see such a crowd, but we're even more happy to have a speaker tonight who had many distinguished careers. Not only did he spend almost 10 years in the Navy, but he also then became a startup entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, including the proverbial buyout from Microsoft at some point. But the reason he's here tonight is because of his claim to fame through libBitcoin library, probably the first implementation after Satoshi in C++, an incredibly well-maintained library that got him into Bitcoin. Tonight, however, he's not talking about the technical aspects of that of his library, but about cryptoeconomics. He will include his experience as an entrepreneur, as an angel investor, as a guy who's been around the block, so to speak, to see how crypto and economics go together. Please welcome Eric Voskuil.
Thanks, Roger. Hello? All right. First of all, thanks, Roger and Lucas. This is like the most professionally run meetup organization I could possibly imagine. I'm from States. I live near Seattle, and once every other week I go down to the pub and we talk Bitcoin, and that's it. You know, that's our meetup. So this is really cool. They've taken me out the last couple days, tried to kill me on the mountain. You know, had kirsch and fondue at my request, and so they haven't killed me with alcohol or gravity yet. Anyway, so let me also apologize right up front. I'm suffering from like an awful cough that I can't get rid of, so I'm going to have a sip of beer every once in a while to keep it under control. So, as Roger said, I'm Eric. This is I have a full bio up on LinkedIn, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. And Twitter is kind of where the nexus of all my Bitcoin stuff tends to go. So I started writing topics on cryptoeconomics, and they're actually on my GitHub site, which I don't have a link for, but it's github.com/libitcoin/libitcoin/wiki. So my background. So yeah, I have a lot of history with different things that are really that kind of relate to Bitcoin. And back in the 90s, mid 90s, I actually got really interested in Chromium Cash. I got myself PGP key. I did all these things. I was all excited about what was going to happen. It didn't happen. So years went by, and I was still in the Navy. I was flying airplanes and going to war and landing on boats. So I had a different life, but I was still interested in it. I still actually wrote code, and did some startup companies, and I was on my third, which failed, and I shut it down. And then I saw an article on the Silk Road in Forbes magazine. It was actually a cover story in Forbes magazine, and I read that, and I was like, wow, this Bitcoin thing I've been hearing about, it's actually not, it doesn't suffer from the ills of Chromium Cash or the deficiencies, and it looks really exciting. And I've been working on that every day since, about 4 years. So I bring a different perspective to this. You're going to hear things, I'm going to talk about things that are going to sound very different than what you're used to. I'm a long time, I guess in 1991 I joined the American Libertarian Party, long-time libertarian. Kind of left that a few years back and decided I was actually an anarchist. So that came out of a long-term study of economics. I'm a Rothbardian, crypto-anarchist, cypherpunk / anarcho-capitalist, right? Lots of labels. So that's me. libitcoin is the developer toolkit that I work on. It was started by Amir Taki. He's that crazy guy who went to Syria to fight ISIS and does Bitcoin. But he started this thing because he wanted to create a better, more scalable library and another base of developers who had expertise. At the time, the Bitcoin Foundation had a little, was gaining control over the process, and he kind of wanted something else. He also created the BIP system that everybody talks about, BIP, this, that, and the other thing, all the change proposals for Bitcoin. So I started working on this. I went out to meet him. And I said, hey, I like his perspective, and been working on it ever since. And now it's kind of become my thing, although we still work together. So this talk is largely about the security architecture of Bitcoin from a cryptoeconomic perspective, which is really the only perspective. In terms of security architecture. At the end, there's the stuff that I really find more interesting because the implications are kind of cool, and there's a lot of subjects that fall into that category. But without the background in security architecture, you can't really have that conversation. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that. So first of all, I go right back to first principles. So Bitcoin is a system based on other systems. They're provable systems. If not, what can you know if you can't prove something, right? So Bitcoin's based on mathematics, probability theory, and praxeology, or economics, for the praxeology uninitiated. So those are systems that are based on assumptions that then, once you accept those assumptions, or if you assume those assumptions are assumable, you move on and prove things about them. So Bitcoin can't be fully understood with just the axioms of math, probability, and economics. There's one more assumption that you have to accept, or you're really not working on Bitcoin. I call it the axiom of resistance. It's an assumption. You can't prove it, but if you don't accept it, you're not working on Bitcoin. And what it means is that we assume we can keep the state, in other words, nation states, out of the money. Now, a lot of times, mostly states will argue they're trying to do that themselves. They set up an external organization to manage the money and, not quite political and try to separate that from the state. But Bitcoin exists to separate the state from the money. And a lot of people might tell you otherwise, and I'm not here to be judgmental or political. I'm just telling you how the security architecture works. And if you don't accept this, you're not working on Bitcoin, and you're working on something completely different. So, where do the benefits that we imagine from Bitcoin come from? So rapid transfer, cross borders with no currency controls, non-inflationary. Where do these things come from? Anybody? Why does Bitcoin have those benefits and say PayPal or Visa doesn't? Wow, that's great. No, nobody?
It's from the brands. When you buy something, you sell something, they give a difference.
So if we can keep state banks out of the money, we don't have those problems, right? And that's really where the benefits of Bitcoin come from. So if you weren't inclined to accept the axiom of resistance, which basically says we assume we can keep the state out of the money, stop and think about what the value proposition of Bitcoin really is. Where do the benefits come from? That's where they come from. If the state has control of the money, those benefits go away. It becomes like every other money. Okay, so that's principle number one. So I'll talk a little bit about the balance of power fallacy. So there's a theory that most people tend to accept because I think a lot of the core devs tend to promote this idea, and others that are actually have quite a bit of experience with Bitcoin, that the security model in Bitcoin is the interplay between miners and merchants. And I don't use the term users ever because it's ambiguous. What's a user in Bitcoin? A spender, a receiver, a miner, an exchange. So I use the term merchant because a merchant is a person who accepts Bitcoin in exchange for stuff or services, right? So if you're accepting Bitcoin, you're the one who validates the money. The spender doesn't care. If you don't validate this money, they're fine with that. If you never send it to the chain, they don't care. The receiver does. So what we have is a system of merchants who have transactions they want confirmed, and miners who actually confirm them. Very much like, say, the Visa network, where we have merchants who swipe that card and used to be, they used to run the thing and take the slip of paper and mail it off to Visa, and Visa would then confirm it. So it's the same idea. So that looks a lot like a market, right? You have buyers and sellers. And it is a market. So merchants are buying confirmation services from miners. Miners are selling them those services. So what markets do you know of where the sellers and the buyers are attacking each other, right? You go to your coffee shop and they're throwing stuff at you and you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. No, it's cooperative, right? Markets are inherently beneficial to both parties. When a trade occurs, both parties benefit. So markets are mutually beneficial. It's not in anybody's interest that's participating in the market to attack the market. So if you assume that the security model exists to protect merchants from miners or miners from merchant, you're missing the entire problem. The security model isn't necessary for that. So people have contemplated that game theory kind of explains how this all works, right? If miners start reversing transactions, attacking the 51% attacking the network, they kind of destroy their own coin, and that's not in their best interest. Well, yeah, that's all true. It's not in their best interest. They're not going to do it. But it misses the point. The security model in Bitcoin is miners and merchants trying to defend their mutual interest from the state. The state is the one organization who always attacks markets. That's what taxes are, right? That's what regulation is. That's what permission is, permitting. So if you need permission to do something, if you're paying a tax on a transaction, it's literally the state saying, we're going to take a piece of your market. So Bitcoin, again, exists to keep the state out of this market. So both miners and merchants have a role in that defense of the market from the state. So the market breaks down into two sides. Both sides have a security aspect, and they independently enforce that, but they can't control each other. Just like your coffee shop can't control you, and you can't control the coffee shop. You can't make them serve you coffee, and they can't make you buy it, right? But they're securing their shop, and you're securing your money. That's kind of how it works. So how is that security implemented? So one of the aspects of the security model on both sides is the idea of risk sharing. Satoshi used the example of BitTorrent and Napster. So Napster, file sharing, copyright violation, et cetera, et cetera. State stepped in and shut it down. One guy was running it, it's all done. But, BitTorrent comes along and takes that problem and allows it to spread out so that every person who wants to can take a little bit of the risk for running the system. So I call that risk sharing. That's why decentralization matters. It means instead of one person having to run the entire system, any number of people can participate, take a little bit of the risk, and therefore, even if they get busted, they don't go to jail for too long. But people still get busted for BitTorrent, right? But people still do it because the risk is lower, because they're sharing the risk. So another aspect of, actually I'll get to that in a second. So this applies to both mining and merchanting. Okay? Miners, you see a lot of big miners right now, and there's a reason for that. But mining can be done at very small scale. It can be done in your basement, in your closet, whatever, and it works perfectly fine. So it's decentralizable. Merchanting or selling stuff is also decentralizable. All you need to be a merchant in Bitcoin, in other words, all you need to receive Bitcoin and to verify that you've received it is a copy of the chain. The chain's public data. So you don't need anybody's permission on either side. All you need is either some electricity or some network to get the chain. And you can spread out, and you can hide, and you can do this stuff. So Bitcoin's a very interesting system. Satoshi was very explicit about the fact that identity was not to be part of the system. Somebody asked him very early on a mailing list, how do you deal with identity? He says, I don't. There's no identity in the system. Why? If you're hiding, and you're spreading out, and you're defending your market from the man, you don't want to identify yourself. So there's no permission required, there's no identity required. That gets us to the public data principle. All the data in Bitcoin is public. There's no encryption, there's no hiding. There's no hiding of any data. You hold on to your private key, but that's yours, right? That's not part of any of the information that anybody needs to validate the chain, to mine, or anything. That's just your ability to prove that you want to transfer some money from one place to another. And even in doing so, you're not creating anything encrypted on the chain. There's no encryption. So Bitcoin doesn't even really technically need digital signatures. So cryptography in Bitcoin is almost non-existent. Think about it. So how do you achieve the ability to mine, which is basically the idea of confirming transactions, like the Visa network? Visa network confirms transactions. The Visa network has identity, right? There's a big building somewhere, and there's people, and they have badges and ID cards, and they do this stuff. But in Bitcoin, anybody does it. So that's the idea of mining, is that by using proof of work, there's just the ability to take more use more energy than somebody else, you get permission to order the transactions. And that's done because of anonymity. Anybody can do it. I was on a panel with Adam Back a couple months ago, and he's mentioned in the Bitcoin white paper as the creator of Hashcash, which is the basis of proof of work. And he pointed out that the reason for Hashcash was anonymity. Hashcash was to prevent spam email. So if somebody sends you email, they run a little proof that they did some work, and they get you receive their email, and you say it's okay. Well, it might still be spam, but it costs some money. And he solves the problem without causing everybody to have to sign their email, because that introduces identity, and identity was not necessary to solve the problem. And cypherpunks really don't like the idea of identity in these systems. You want to be anonymous so they can hide from the man. So that's on the mining side, and then on the merchant side, and again, to be a merchant, all you need is public data. The chain is entirely public data. There's no encryption necessary. You don't need to encrypt connections. And you don't want to, because the more you lock down connections and prevent people from accessing the data, the less secure the system becomes. Just the opposite of, say, a banking network system where you want to keep out all the bad guys, because the data itself is not secure. It's the connections that have to be secured. If somebody can get inside those connections, they can move money around and do all kinds of crazy stuff. Bitcoin doesn't work that way. The data is public. So we have public data and we have decentralizability on both sides of the security model. And so people can spread out and they can hide. They can be anonymous. And by doing so, it's all secure, right? No, it's not. Let me see if this is the right slide. Okay, perfect. I just make this stuff up as I go along, and I'm always surprised when my slides line up with what I want to say next. So the social network principle. So if we take if we imagine the network of Bitcoin and decentralization, I always kind of remember the original kind of paper that described, I think it was like 1968, describes distributed networks, decentralized networks, and centralized networks. Anybody familiar with that? It's like Paul Banyan or something, maybe. Yeah, it's a graphic. It's really simple. You see it all the time, right? Three little network things, black and white. And so that kind of shows what we mean by decentralized. But what graph are we, when we talk about Bitcoin security on these two different security systems, miners and merchants, what graph are we talking about? Is it the peer-to-peer network? No? No, it's not. And this always blows people's minds. Like, it's not the peer-to-peer network. What else could it possibly be? It's a social network. It's a network between people. And so what I mean by that is every node in the graph represents, if you're talking about Bitcoin security and decentralization providing security, every node has to represent something. What does it mean? Each node is, if you have more nodes and they're more connected, that's more security, right? But if every node represents a computer and then every edge on the graph represents the peer-to-peer network, what does it mean if I personally run 100,000 computers and connect them all up and connect them to the Bitcoin network? Has the network become more secure? Nope, because I'm one person and I only have a limited ability to resist somebody coming and saying, change your rules, right? So decentralization requires lots of people, to individually resist. The axiom of resistance, right? That's where we started. So that graph is a graph between people. If you've got one person that runs all the computers in the network and you got this great big peer-to-peer network and Coinbase's CEO is like running the merchant side and Bitmain is running the mining side, they're like, there's a bunch of mines, but there's one person in charge. You have a graph of one and a graph of one, which means your security is one, right? As opposed to much bigger. So if the man wants to step in and say, change your rules, censor some transactions, what do? They go to Brian, CEO of Coinbase, and they say, change the rules. And he says, okay, all the rules change on all 10,000 computers, whatever. They go to Jihan from Bitmain, and they say, you can't mine these transactions. So he does it. No security whatsoever. So the graph we're talking about is people. So at this point, it's interesting to talk about, like, what does the state want? Why do they want to attack the money? What's the principle at work here? So we'll talk about this in more detail at the end, but there's two things that governments don't don't like about Bitcoin, or they won't like once they figure out what it is. And it's interesting because one is on the merchant side and one is on the miner side. So the merchants have to defend against one of these change demands, and the miners have to defend against the other. So state really does not like the idea of not being able to print money, right? Lose the inflation tax, lose seigniorage revenues, or seigniorage if you're French. And why is that? Because it's a huge source of tax revenue. And that is why we have fiat money. And we'll talk about that more later. Okay, so how would, if you wanted to attack the system and go to, say, the one guy that runs all the computers and say, change something, what would you say? You would say, you need to accept a new rule into your rule base for Bitcoin. Now we'll call this FedCoin, at least in the US. And that rule is any transaction that I sign can issue new coin, right? Now I'm all set, I'm all happy, right? I get, boom, it's a new Coinbase transaction if you're technical and you know Bitcoin. So I have inflation, but I still don't have everything I want, because what else does the state like about money? Especially new modern money. Anyone? Come on. There's bankers in here, right? What do they make you do, you bankers? Right, they want to know what's going on. Why do they want to know what's going on? Stopping terrorism, whatever. They want to know what's going on because that's how they make you pay your tax. That's how they make everybody pay their tax. If you don't know what transactions are occurring, it's much harder to enforce tax. So, you're probably all aware, paper, tangible money is going away. We'll have a fully electronic money system very soon. And every transaction will be visible to the state because the entire network, right, is under its control. You cannot push a transaction through the Visa network, through SWIFT, through any banking system in the world without the state knowing about it. So Bitcoin comes along and says, we're just going to let anybody transact whatever they want. And there's problems with privacy in Bitcoin. Set that aside. Still, you push a transaction through, they can't really stop it. So on the mining side, miners get to determine the order of transactions, but they also get to determine what transactions don't get mined, right? So on this is what we call censorship, right? These are two simple ideas, inflation and censorship. That's what the state wants. They want to be able to censor transactions because if they're censored, in other words, they can say, you cannot mine a transaction that I haven't signed, right? Then I can ensure that I only sign transactions where I know who's doing what. KYC, AML, right? Really simple. So if they get those two rule changes, or the one rule change and one, hash power enforced censorship, then the money's perfect. Right? So it's actually perfect. So I suggest that that's what you'll see. There'll be Fed coins popping up, and then Bitcoin will go into a kind of a different phase, which I'll talk about in a second. Am I losing everybody, or are we good? It's good. All right, good. Okay, so we get into, this is kind of the tail end of the security model discussion. There's a lot more to it, but it's the broad strokes. So Bitcoin is war by other means. What am I referring to? Diplomacy, yeah. Who said it? Who's the? All right, Karl von Clausewitz. Right? I figured there's some German speakers in here, they might know. Von Clausewitz is I guess he was Prussian general, Napoleonic war time frame. He wrote the book called On War, or whatever it is in German, like On Krieg or something, right? And in it he says, war is the continuation of politics or diplomacy, depending on the translation, by other means. So my theory is that Bitcoin is a continuation of war by other means. In other words, it's actually a peaceful conflict, a relatively low-level conflict. In relation to what would happen otherwise if, states bleeding people dry and they break out the pitchforks and set up the barricades and say, hey, we don't want to be taxed to death anymore. So Russian Revolution, or you name it. So Bitcoin gives people the opportunity to fight back just by spending a little money, and I'll explain to you how that happens. But this is also important in understanding really how the security model works. And there's an important principle here that you should understand. There's no magic crypto. Believe me, I've been through every single line of the code many times, written it all myself over and over again. And I've been looking, and there's just absolutely nothing in the code that secures Bitcoin. People secure Bitcoin. There's no magic crypto, no magic math or anything like that. Bitcoin is a tool to help people secure Bitcoin, to help people secure their money. And it does that by allowing them to spread out their use of it and to do it anonymously so they can hide. But if they don't resist, there's no security. And that's true with any security system. You don't have any neighbors, doesn't matter, you have a lock on your house, it's going to get broken into and people take all your stuff, right? If you have a firewall, if you don't have a lock on the door and a guy to respond to, the lock getting broken with a gun or something, somebody's going to walk in and unplug your firewall, and now your network's not secure anymore. So people provide security, and that's true with Bitcoin. So the other means principle is the idea that there's this kind of low-level war that occurs, and there's 4 stages to this that are outlined in Satoshi's original white paper, but more specifically, you can just see them in the code. So the first stage should be pretty obvious. I call it the honeymoon principle. The honeymoon phase, right? Nobody cares. It's too small. We came up with this thing. Satoshi's running it on his home machine, and great. Nobody's attacking it. So it gets to do what it wants. That's where we are now. Low-level attack here and there, but pretty much nobody cares. And so we're in the honeymoon phase. So what happens next? We start to have an impact, right? Start to be too successful. And at some point, the state says, well, if we don't do something, we're going to lose inflation tax, and we're going to lose visibility into all transactions, right? Everything will just go to Bitcoin. Why not? Why wouldn't it, right? There's scaling stuff, but that's fine. So if they don't act, it's going to go bad. It's going to start going bad, and then they're going to act. And what are they going to do? They say, we got this great Fed coin thing over here. These 2 rule changes, it makes it all great. Protect everybody from the money launderers and the pornographers and the gamblers and whatever other victimless crime you can think of. And so they get this great Fed coin, and that's it's like, look over here while we make this other thing illegal. So Bitcoin becomes just illegal, black market money. Why wouldn't it, right? Wouldn't want to allow it. That's what's going to happen. So people say you can't ban Bitcoin. That's just nonsense, right? You can ban anything. You just sign here, banned. Question is whether you can enforce the ban, and that's what we want to talk about. So I think it should be obvious from looking at the design and the white paper that the reason for decentralization and anonymity is so that you can survive that phase, right? Otherwise, who cares, right? If you stay in the honeymoon phase and nobody's going to attack it, you don't need decentralization. You don't need anonymity. You just operate like big companies doing money. Microsoft could make a great Microsoft bucks, and Google could make theirs, and Apple could make theirs, and be great. Never under attack. State's never going to step in and say, hey, we want KYC, AML, inflation, et cetera. But we know that's going to happen. So phase 2 is what I call the black market phase. You go from honeymoon to black market. Maybe not all at the same time, but and maybe it doesn't happen, but it's envisioned by the security model. It's how it's designed. So now things start to spread out. Coinbase kind of either becomes FedCoin or it goes away because it can't sit there and be a massive company and just say, no, we're not taking your rule changes, and we're just going to keep on doing Bitcoin even though it's illegal. Same thing with big miners. So the important thing about Bitcoin from a security standpoint is that it's decentralizable, not that it's decentralized. So PayPal, for example, is not decentralizable. There's nothing it can do. It can't, its architecture doesn't allow it to kind of spread out and hide and all that. So it's, it doesn't have this option. By the way, PayPal started out as an attempt to solve this problem. Believe it or not. The company was called Confinity. Some libertarian guys, wanted to enable mobile-to-mobile payments, which is crazy, thinking about how early it was. But mobile-to-mobile payments to circumvent currency controls, especially in the third world, places where they had really steep, stiff currency controls. And of course, it didn't work because, you got to solve these problems. So they sold to eBay and did payment processing for eBay, and then they sold to them. So you go from that second phase where it's just illegal, but of course, does that work? I mean, probably increases use, I would think, right? Every kind of peaceful activity that gets banned just kind of tends to get more popular. So I haven't won the drug war yet, haven't stopped prostitution yet. Switzerland gave up, I guess. Portugal gave up on the drug war, but still pretty much everywhere else in the world, these things are still being fought. Americans are still fighting the war on gambling. So it doesn't work. And then so these guys in the, these guys in Congress and the White House, they scratch their heads and go, what do we do? This thing's just getting worse. We have this global war on Bitcoin, and this stuff's growing like a weed, and we can't stop it. Money laundering everywhere. So what do? They get out this video, and they look at phase 3. They go, what should we, because I'm going to tell them what they're going to, so they start mining. Right? That's the next phase. And that's clearly envisioned by the Soshi's white paper, right? 51% attack. If you can control 51% of the hash power, you control the coin. You can prevent any confirmation. You can censor transactions. So at least they get the censorship objective if they can get 51% of the hash power. So they start mining. And mining, and they're censoring transactions, and let's assume they get to 51%. So they're not allowing transactions through that don't have the seal of approval on them. So now we've solved the problem, right? We've got, basically have FedCoin. So does that work? Well, they're not. So there's other people trying to mine these transactions that are banned, that are censored. And that potential money to be made from those transactions is incenting some bunch of hash power. And on the other side, you got the state mining system, which is not taking the fees from those transactions, which means it's operating at a loss. Right? If you're going to try to stop Bitcoin transactions from going through and you don't take any of them, you get no fees, you've got to subsidize that with some other money, right? So the state takes their power to tax, they tax people, they subsidize mining. And that's their advantage. They can do that. They can do that until people break out the pitchforks. So you have state subsidized mining, censoring transactions. And what happens in the free market to all the transactions that aren't getting mined? Or maybe sometimes aren't getting mined. Fee levels rise because there's demand and it's not being fulfilled. And in the market, when demand's not being filled, price rises. There's more demand than there is supply, so price is rising. So as fee levels rise, what happens? People that maybe wouldn't mine go, wow, look at all that money sitting out there. I can get like 10x return on my capital if I just go mine some of these black market transactions. So people break out their mining rigs in their basements and they start mining illegal transactions. And so what you end up with is a system where fees are rising to get transactions through the system, and taxes are rising to stop them. Right? So here we are at the trenches, right, of the war. Right? There's a balance between these two systems. So this is what I call the competitive phase. States competing with the free market to try to stop this stuff from happening. And the free market just keep throwing money at it. So in a 51% attack, if one side or the other side is winning, they win everything. There's no reward from the mining on the other side. So it's a total loss. So that implies that it's likely one side or the other will give up. Because if you keep taxing people higher and higher and higher to stop this thing, and that can't stop it, probably going to give up and go, Portugal on the drug war or Switzerland on prostitution or something, right? It's just you just give up. Say can't beat them, so we'll just use this good money and give up our inflation tax. Right? So I call that last phase surrender. Of course, it's not a permanent phase. You can cycle back into once everybody kind of re-centralizes because everything's working well and cheap again, then you can do it again. But the point is, if people want their stateless money, they can have it, but it's not free. They have to pay for it. Right? They have to pay the fees to get the state out of their money. So the trade-off is pitchforks or fees. Right? That's the other means principle. Is it good? So this gets us to the more interesting stuff. I've only got like 3 slides, and then I'm all done. So I figured we'd have like a room full of bankers. I don't know. I think it was advertised more as a tech talk, so maybe we didn't get as many bankers as we want. But I thought we'd talk about reserve currency. So yeah, reserve currency is the problem, not the solution. So there's a theory going around that Bitcoin will become, say it doesn't scale so well, so it'll just become a reserve currency. The banks will all hold it, and then we'll just continue to use kind of the existing financial system for transaction. But because it's Bitcoin, banks can't really mess with it, so it'll be good. That's the theory. So to explain this theory, I cooked up my own monetary theory, or political public policy theory. It's called the reservation principle. And basically what it says is the reason for a reserve is fiat, right? The reason, so what's the gold standard? Is it everybody using gold? No, it's everybody using paper. Did it work? Because some people, like some, even some, good libertarian economist types, some Austrians would say, the gold standard was really good. It lasted for a couple hundred years. Everybody used it. It was all good. So did it work? No, it didn't work. It didn't work for us. It worked for them, right? Because what the gold standard is, and this is just an analogy. It's an example, but I'll get back to the Bitcoin thing in a second. What the gold standard is, like every other reserve, is I want the gold and you have it, so I'll give you paper and you'll give me the gold. That's good for me, right? Even if I don't delink them, it's good for me, right? Wouldn't you want to be in that position? You're the one holding all the gold and they've got all the paper, and by the way, you're the only one that can print the paper if you want to? That's awesome, right? Because it means that you can liquidate that reserve at any time you want. You can go to war, which they did, and they liquidated the reserve, so they got what they wanted. What did everybody else get? A big tax, big bill. So in the U.S., when they had accumulated most of it through the Federal Reserve System, which only took about 15 years or so, 1933 comes along, and what do? They took the rest. Just passed a law that says all the rest of it is just ours. It's illegal for you to have gold or contract in gold. So yeah, it worked really well if you were the state. It did not work at all if you were an individual trying to save some money. So what is a reserve? First of all, do companies have reserves? Do individuals have reserves? What do you call your reserve? Savings. Right? It's not called a reserve. It's called savings. So if a country had a pile of money in the vault, it would be called savings. A reserve is something different. A reserve is a reservation against a fiat. That's it. So what a reserve allows a country to do is use its power to compel, to prevent other people, this gets a little technical, but to prevent other people from making the fiat, right? In other words, if people started using paper as a money with nice pictures on it and they all had to be just right and that was a money, and everybody could make it, it would have the same characteristics as gold or silver. You'd just be a lot more of it when you went to buy something. But the state uses its power to not allow you to make that money. It's called counterfeiting when you do that. So it reserves for itself the right to do that. And from that, it gets the benefit of signage. It restricts the supply, but it can provide the supply. So it gets, in the Gresham's law sense, it gets the good money, the money that can't be inflated, can't be printed more cheaply than it can be produced, and it gives you the bad money. And so as a result, it has the ability to then, once you're all using the bad money, print more, tax, that's the inflation tax, or liquidate the reserve if it needs to pay some other country or companies for weapons or whatever it needs for its latest war. So that's the whole idea behind reservation. It's really a tax machine. The gold standard was a great tax machine. So the reserve currency fallacy. So this idea that Bitcoin could become a reserve currency for all the banks, and banks all use it, and state banks, right? All banks are owned by the state. So how would that work now that you understand the security model? Who prevents the state from stepping in and saying, we want that new rule, that inflation rule? Who's going to stop that? How many merchants are there in the graph that are accepting Bitcoin and saying no to the bad money? Just one, globally, right? The G8 or whatever, the banker club. So they just changed the rule. There's nothing to stop it, except the pitchforks again. So we go back to that. So setting that aside, why would the state do it? If they couldn't change the rules, why would they want to do that? So say Bitcoin as a reserve couldn't be inflated, and the fiat that was issued against it was somehow magically linked in a strong enough way that they couldn't inflate it. Why would they have a reserve? There'd be no reason, right? They would just use the Bitcoin. There's no benefit there's no ability to create a reserve. They're functionally equivalent currencies, right? The one you're using and the one they're holding is the same, 1 to 1, right? That was the whole principle of the gold, the gold standard, 1 to 1. But that wasn't the principle, right? So So there would be no interest in doing it. Two, it would be completely unsecurable because they just changed the rules however they wanted. Three, the idea that it could be audited and therefore could be prevented from being inflated, if there was a too secure, paper and Bitcoin, is completely false. It can't be audited. You can take a snapshot in time, look at the blockchain, and the state could issue some crypto that says, we own all these endpoints, this much Bitcoin, and yeah, you could know that, but how would you know how much paper is out there? How would you compare the two, right? That was the problem with the gold standard. They just kept cranking out the paper and didn't tell anybody. And then France shows up and said, hey, we want our gold. And they're like, oh crap, there's not nearly enough gold. So sorry, doors closed, windows closed, right? That was 1971. So yeah, there's no way to audit it. If there was a way to secure it against that inflation, then again, it would just be Bitcoin. Like say Lightning Network, right? Lightning is, it has that property. It's a layer over Bitcoin. And so, maybe I'm getting technical here, but you can't inflate it. It's just, it makes a security trade-off. So state could have the reserve and everybody else gets Lightning. No, it doesn't really work that way. There'd be no reserve. It would just be Bitcoin. So the reserve currency idea is a complete scam. Don't fall for it. And that's all I got. I could talk all night, but you guys are getting thirsty, I'm sure.
Any questions?
Hi, I didn't quite understand. You mentioned if the G8 adopts it as a reserve, how does the G8 just change the rules? Isn't that a hard fork, or?
Yep.
Then that's not Bitcoin. That wouldn't be the Bitcoin that the merchants
they just
as Bitcoin, right?
They wouldn't. If everybody was using Bitcoin, they took possession of all of the merchanting, right? All the receiving of Bitcoin, everything came into the Federal Reserve systems, ECB, et cetera. They all work together, right? IMF, ECB, Federal Reserve, all these systems, they work together to stabilize the money. So they're the only ones validating the coin. So if they get together and they say, let's change the rules, like say Ethereum did a while back, right? Let's change the rules. They do. So nothing to stop them, right?
So the merchants would be under control of the G8, you're saying?
The merchants in this sense would be the G8. It would be the only ones actually receiving coin because you're all moving paper around and they've got all the Bitcoin. They're receiving the Bitcoin from each other, presumably, right? It's just being shuffled back and forth between the banks, just like gold is, or similar.
So let's say the currency war gets pretty serious, like China or the U.S. Really decide to take control of Bitcoin. How do you see that playing out? Do you think that the network will just resist and hard fork, or do you think that there will be sort of a prolonged period of confusion over the network?
So when you say resist and hard fork, it sounds like you're referring to something very specific, which is the idea that if the state is, and I refer to the state as like one big organization, right? Because it works together. Sorry, my son is calling me. It's not distracting. So yeah, it works together as one big organization. If it decided to get together and start mining, and it sounds like you're implying that the economy, merchants, right, could just go, let's just hard fork, which means we're going to change. We're all the bazillion merchants in the world that accept Bitcoin are, again, remember it's black market money at this point, right? That's why the state's mining it, because that's not working. So it's all been spread out, and all these illegal activities or the legal money decides as a group they're just going to make a change, and that can certainly happen. If the change is popular enough, most people could make the change and you'd have a new money. So now you could make a change that makes the mining investment that the state has made in mining the coin essentially useless. Any specialized hardware that's dedicated to the proof of work algorithm that all the merchants validate now becomes useless, right? So I have a topic in my book thing called the proof of work fallacy. It's this idea that a proof of work hard fork can stop, say, 51% attacks. And actually what would happen is it would make them easier. So think about what happens. Everybody gets together and say, they changed this rule. So now there's no miners, right? You just wipe them all out. Good, bad, otherwise they're all gone. Everybody that was mining in their basement, all these people are trying to make some money mining against the states, subsidized mining, they're all the specialized hardware is gone. Everything, the other stuff's good, network, infrastructure, security, whatever, but the specialized hardware is gone. It's kind of expensive. So now you have a coin that's got no security, right? Anybody can attack it. So it becomes unusable for a while. And then maybe the honest miners, which are the ones that aren't censoring, maybe they make some investments in some hardware to go mine again on the new rules. Now, put yourself in their shoes. Are you a little bit concerned about this investment? Is this going to be the same thing again and again and again? So what stops the state from doing it again? Lack of revenue? Lack of capital to go buy mining rigs? Not at all, right? So they just go do it again. Everybody else who did it also is in the same situation again. They get hard forked again, hash power drops down to 0 again, the money's not usable for a while, and people try it again. So if you're smart and you're like a banker in the room, you probably realize that what you'd have to do is you'd have to insure against that eventuality, right? You wouldn't make this investment unless you had insurance against it. That insurance is the way to describe the cost that's occurring. What's happening is every time you do it, you're raising the insurance cost. You're raising the cost of mining, the necessary cost of mining. As a result, you're getting less hash power for the same fee level. So the security level of the network keeps dropping as you do this for several reasons, and nothing stops the state from continuing to do it. So I think it's a really silly idea, and it's one of those things I love talking about because it's just so popular of an idea, but it doesn't make any sense. Not that it's not a good question. It is a good question.
So related to that same time period, when they're in the competitive phase, you brought up the fact that the state would subsidize and essentially go for no fees and a 51% attack.
Or fees for legal transactions, but not the other fees.
Yeah, but the legal transactions are the majority. So they wouldn't have to subsidize much. The fees wouldn't go up very much. If I'm the state and I see that I win automatically in a hard fork, and I win automatically if I charge fees, and then control the network and can censor whenever I want, isn't that a lose-lose situation?
No, because there's a economic error, a financial error in that set of assumptions. If the state can get enough transactions for every block to fill the block with legal fee-paying transactions, that does not mean that it's not mining at a loss. Sorry for the double negative. It's still mining at a loss if there are other transactions that are willing to pay higher fees to get into those blocks. So what's happening is you have people who need to get transactions confirmed. They keep raising their fee level. State's not accepting those fees, but other people are, right? And as other people are mining, blocks get discovered more frequently, right? So the state is competing with those other miners who are making more money, and because they're making more money, the rate of return on capital is higher. They're continuing to add more and more and more hash power. So to offset that hash power, the state has to subsidize their mining. They have to add more hash power without getting the fees that everybody else is getting. So they are operating at a loss, and they have to subsidize that loss. Now, once they get to 51% and they can sustain that, everybody else is getting nothing, and they win, right? But the presumption is that fee level keeps rising and causes the same problem over and over and over again.
The CIA imports drugs, though. They don't have a problem with breaking the rules as long as it gives them control. I would go through all of the illegal fees or all of the illegal transactions just so I can control 100% of the system, see 100%, and then censor very, very rarely. It seems...
Mining's a zero-sum game. So premium for one party is a loss for the other party. It's not like any other market. The mining aspect of the market, the competition between miners is zero-sum. So if one miner has a subsidy, it's like a tax on all other miners. If other miners have a premium because one isn't taking all the fees, then it's like a tax on the person that's not taking all the fees. They're going to win fewer blocks at the same hash rate. That's going to cost them more for the electricity than they're actually making in fees because of the zero-sum nature of mining.
Aren't it the people in the end that demanding the currency which decides what continues besides of the miners and
I'm sorry, could you restate? I didn't quite understand.
In the end, it's the people demanding money which decides what continues. Like
right.
Just to another fork, with people go over there. So I don't see it that dangerous. Even if there is a G20 crackdown on Bitcoin, and the effect to ban paper money would push people even into cryptocurrencies, assets. So,
yeah, it's certainly possible that the market can win. But important observation is you can't assume it, you can't prove it. You have to. So the axiom of resistance, the assumption of the whole system is that it's possible to defeat the state. If you did not believe it was possible, you wouldn't work on this, right? You would just do PayPal or something. And there's a good example. I have this little short topic. It's kind of a funny one, but I think it's funny. It's called the Hearn error. Anybody remember Mike Hearn? Right? So I felt comfortable using his name in this. Actually, usually what I tell people is that the title was chosen at random and doesn't refer to anybody. But because I had a back and forth discussion on Bitcoin Dev with him about this subject, and we're talking about he had just published some blog about the security model of Bitcoin. And this is what happens when you just don't accept the axiom of resistance. He was unwilling to accept that the state could be defeated. So as soon as you drop that, you're working on a completely different system. And his security model was completely different than what I described to you. And you may have heard this many times before. You may have even believed this before you walked in this room. You may still believe it. I don't know. But the security model he described was popularity defends Bitcoin. And he literally said, or he specifically said, states cannot ban popular things. It's like the head. What? How do you think that the state cannot? The state only bans popular things, right? Think of anything that's banned, and I'm not just talking about like outright prohibited, because there's almost nothing that's outright prohibited. Even in the U.S., you can get Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4 drugs with permission. You have to pay. It means you have to pay, right? When something's banned, you have to pay more for it. So, but yeah, I mean, you can gamble. But you got to use, like in the U.S., we have state gambling is everywhere, right? There's lotteries all over the place. Gambling's generally illegal, so they get to do it. So, labor. Does anybody pay tax on their income? Working is popular, and it's also illegal unless you pay for permission. So, what about unpopular things? Things that nobody does. Are they generally banned? No, there's no money to be made on that. Okay, so this is my cynical point of view, right? State only bans popular things. But even if you don't believe that, at least you might accept that historically the state does actually ban very popular things. So it's a silly argument, right? Gold was very popular. Sound money was very popular. And in 1933, FDR said, yeah, all that good money is ours. We're taking it. It's illegal to use it. So even in money, right, there's a glaring example of how silly that argument is. So popularity will not itself defend Bitcoin from a state attack where you centralize it all up, forget about the whole security model and just hope, it's PayPal without any of the costs. And we're just going to continue to circumvent currency controls and get all these great benefits, and the state can't ban it because now it's too popular. That's silly. So I don't know, I forgot what the original question was, but...
Eric, I have one question. So you're speaking a lot about the money and so, but today, if you're looking at the money, 3% of the money is created by central banks, and 97% of money is created by commercial banks as a credit money, and all of this money is in circulation together. So how do you want to approach this situation? So what's your view on this?
Well, I mean, if you talk about like value, right, like capital, it's much bigger than money, right? Like the value of this building is capital. It's worth something. It can be traded. You don't need to go through currency to necessarily do that. So there's a huge amount more capital in the world than there is currency. And there's a lot of different types of money, right? Things we call money that are not necessarily currency. But control over the money allows you to tax people who hold the money. So anybody who's a high net worth individual who has half a wit knows how to avoid inflation, right? I mean, do you keep all your savings in cash? Anybody? Nobody wants to admit. So, yeah, I do. So, yeah, because I'm willing to pay 5 to 10%, every year to the state to hold my money in cash.
Can I rephrase it? We are focusing here a lot on the 3% discussion. So what happens with the base money? But what's the discussion about the credit money? What happens with 97%? That's the most money that we're using.
So you're implying, are you referring to fractional reserve? The monetary expansion through fractional reserve, so you have 3% currency and you get 97% more credit-based money, all right? So to me, like in a free banking world, right, this is the idea of free banking, I don't care really about fractional reserve. And that's like the one tiny topic where I differ from Rothbard because he gets really, bent around the axle about fractional reserve. But I'm pretty sure that's because fractional reserve or banking as we know it is really a state institution, right? So the taxpayers end up providing the backing for the implicitly failed system of. All right. So banking as we know it, right? Bank your money, get more money back with some interest, is investment. It's just an investment. It's just you have a group of people who do the investing for you, and then you get your part of the return in a free market, right? Free banking system. So if we put all of our money into these banks and they went out and invested all this, and we said, well, I want demand draw rights on that, right? So I want to be able. Not only do I have an investment that's out and somebody's using my money to farm their fields and build buildings and stuff, but I want to be able to pull it out at any time. It's kind of silly, right? It doesn't really make sense. So that doesn't get to the level we have in the state banking system when you're looking at free banking, right? Like real banking is just investment. People make investments. Sometimes they fail. They suffer the loss. If they want demand withdrawal, they're not going to make really any money, right? It's really just a vault at that point. But we have state banking where the state says, I want to give a political benefit to all of my constituents, and that political benefit is risk-free rate of return, right? Oh, sorry. So there's no such thing as risk-free rate of return. So in order to achieve that, they basically take the same constituents and they say, when this doesn't work out, we'll just take it back, right? We'll tax you by inflating the currency. So fractional banking is kind of the system that's designed to fail, but it provides a political benefit. And so you get this big monetary expansion that, as a result, where credit expansion, you put money in a bank and they lend it back out, and people put it back in, they lend it back out, they put it back in, lend it back out, and anybody can withdraw any amount of it at any time. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? But voters want it. It's cool, right? And it's kind of like if you go to like Frederick Bastiat, right? What is seen and what is not seen. I see this great benefit. I get interest, put my money in there, they invest it for me, I take it out anytime I want. What they're not seeing is they're paying for it on the other end. They're paying for it through banking bailouts, inflation tax that covers those bailouts and everything. So in the end, as the system goes on long enough, what do you get? Negative real rate of return. Right? Any European countries that have negative real rate of return today? I think there are. I can't remember which ones I was last time. So that's what it ends up, right? It's a net loss trying to support the system because you're also supporting all the bureaucrats in between that are providing the system, that are implementing the system. But what makes that system possible? Inflation tax. It's very easy to tax. Just crank it up, pay for the bailout or pay for whatever you need to continue to support this system. So I am talking about all the money, right? And the inflation tax is what enables the fractional reserve system to be backed by the taxpayers, because the taxpayers are the people paying the inflation tax. So if you hold currency, you're a taxpayer. If you hold state currency, you're a taxpayer. If you hold commodity currency, gold, whatever, you're not an investor. You're hedging against inflation. You're a speculator, but you're not an investor. If you lend people your money and you expect a return, you're an investor. So Bitcoin only attempts to solve or to mitigate the problems associated with the currency, because to do transactions, to have savings in a given money, there's some time which you're holding this money. And during that time where you're holding the money, if it's subject to inflation tax, you're paying the tax. So people with higher net worth, they have a smaller percentage of their smaller percentage of their net worth in cash because they're minimizing the inflation tax. Hold assets, so stocks, maybe hold some commodities as a hedge, but really you're holding debt and equity, which are, from an economic standpoint, debt and equity are really the same thing. They're just regulatory distinctions. So you're lending people your money and you're getting some return back over time, and that's great. No inflation because you're not holding the cash. So Bitcoin actually is oriented, if you think about it that way, is oriented towards helping people who have lower net worth because they have a lot higher percentage of their net worth in cash, if not all of it. I don't know, rambling on about this subject, but it's a good question.
All right.
One more?
Actually, we probably want to finish here.
I'll get you.
Eric is going to hang around for a little while afterwards, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Eric, for the insights that you shared. I found many interesting aspects, so I'm looking forward to watching the video on bitcoinlectures.tv that we're taking here. It'll be up in maybe about 10 days.